I show that it is 2 o'clock straight up, so we will call this special meeting of the Oklahoma County Jail Trust Advisory Committee together. It was properly posted on Friday, September 8th, 2017. Turning to item number 3, discussion and/or possible action to approve the minutes from the special meeting on August 15th, 2017. Before I open that up to a motion, I will note a Scrivener's error in the 8th paragraph. First line, last word, Allen is spelled A-L-L-A-N as opposed to A-L-L-E-N. Are there any other corrections or changes? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion to adopt the minutes subject to the correction that I've enumerated.
So moved. Second.
All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion carries 3-0. Item number 4, this is following up on something that we approved at the last meeting, and that is to work to retain counsel to advise us and help us as we go through this process of putting together a jail trust. So I'd like to introduce Mr. Alan Brooks, who is with the, I want to make sure I get this name right, the Oklahoma Public Finance Law Group. Is that right? And many of us have worked with or known Mr. Brooks, and of course his firm, and working with Gary Bush for many years on bond issues here at the county. And so Alan is here for us to, again, engage in a conversation like we have been doing with many of our stakeholders and things like that, and to help us really start the process of putting pen to paper and working on the document that we adopted as our working draft at the very first committee meeting. So, Mr. Brooks, if you want to join us over here at the table, and
I'm going to introduce Meredith Morgan, also in our office, another lawyer.
Wonderful.
And, she is going to join me.
Okay.
She's going to answer the hard questions.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Morgan. So, Alan has had a brief opportunity, I will say, to review the trust document that we've been working with. He is, like all good attorneys, has been very busy traveling, and he is going to have to be at a meeting with Oklahoma City by 3 o'clock, which is good because that then means we have to be out of here by 2:50, which is always great to have a time limit. And so we've had some very brief discussions, but what I wanted to do was to talk about some of the things that we've discussed, our concerns, our questions regarding setting up a trust, and then see what sort of insight he can provide, and then if we can start to provide direction about what we want this to look like. The first question that I would ask goes to scope. And one of the questions that has come up in this group is, how broadly do we define the authority of the trust? Primarily, we're looking at a group that would help manage or oversee finances, but also operations to a certain extent. Not day-to-day operations necessarily, but the retaining and oversight of the administrator of the jail, which again, we have a great administrator at the moment. I believe the scope of services or the scope of authority is outlined on page 3, paragraph 1 of our draft document, for those of you who follow along. And so I'll turn it over to you, Mr. Brooks, as far as any...
Do you have copies?
Not extra. I don't.
I think that we make have a copy. I'm sorry.
I do. I do.
Yeah, go ahead and make me one back.
I don't need one. I'm prepared.
I
like
didn't
this committee already.
But anyways, go.
Oh, we have
I know. I think we can, just for the purposes of time,
What do you got mine for?
we can go ahead and get started.
I didn't tell you how I prepared. Well,
in your office.
let's just talk broad generalities. There are, as you all probably know even better than I do, I mean, Randy and I talked about this a little bit. There's your basic Title 60 public trust. I mean, that's the vast majority of public trusts state of Oklahoma created. That's the general public trust law. It's the statute under which state, county, city or town beneficiary trusts are typically created. You've also got the Title 19 provisions that, I mean, again, this is what you all might well know better than I do. I'm not aware of any jail trusts that have been set up under Title 19. There might well be some out there through the County Commissioner Association. You could probably find that. Until reading the Tulsa case last night, I had worked under the assumption from a fuzzy memory that they were a Title 19 trust, but the reality they're a Title 60 trust, and the lawsuit was an effort to say they needed to be a Title 19 trust, which the Supreme Court disagreed with. So again, those are the two vehicles that are out there. In conversations that Randy and I have had, you all have generally made a decision you want to go and look at the Title 60 trust, which I think makes sense. I mean, the Title 19 trust is the beginning point, requires an election to even create the trust, which again is not required under Title 60. I understand. I think Gary maybe prepared. Gary Bush maybe kind of took a first crack at this document. Randy, I think you've worked on it some since then.
Only the good parts.
Okay, I'll tell Gary that when I talk to him. I mean, this is your basic boilerplate public trust document. It's been modified to make it specific to county jail type purposes.
Right.
There's some references in here to Title 62 economic development purposes. The point that I made, and this is a business decision, ultimately that a recommendation you'll make to commissioners and ultimately a decision they'll make, but I mean, there's really no significant downside from a legal standpoint into having the document perhaps broader than you need it to be, as opposed to you narrow it down to the point that you decide in the future you want to do something, and then you have to go in and modify the document. I mean, the trustees and ultimately the county, I think, are going to dictate what you do. In other words, those purposes are just by virtue of the fact that those purposes and powers are there, doesn't mean that you use them. Okay, and ultimately, before you can do them, you've got to find funding for, which again, the commissioners have the ultimate say-so there in terms of where the dollars come from. So I think the breadth of the document is not necessarily a problem, but I mean, we can make it ultimately as tight and restrictive or as broad as you desire to make the document.
Well, the chair has a question along those grounds. You said there's a benefit to keeping it rather broad, so at a later point you don't have to go in and modify. Typically under these type of trusts, what is the procedure for modification?
Well, there are actually provisions in the document that says it can be amended by a 2/3 vote of the trustees of the authority and a 2/3 vote of the county commissioners. So that's the process. You can't do anything. As an example, to the extent you had debt outstanding, bondholders, state, banks or lenders. I mean, you, in theory, couldn't go out anything that would do anything to the detriment of the debt holder, but by virtue of providing for amendment, I can't think of many things you would do that would arguably be a detriment. So you do have the ability to amend the document, so that's just really more procedural stuff.
Any questions with relation to scope?
I have one, Mr. Chairman. Currently, there's some trust in effect now, and I've read some audit reports, and there's some concerns as far as responsibility of the trustees and the responsibilities of the sheriff's office. And I would think that was something we'd have to be specific about. We're talking about, operational possibly, and we're talking about financial, I would think that those items would have to be defined, at least where the trustees would know what their responsibilities are, and the sheriff's office would know.
I think a big picture point, I mean, as I think of a trust document, it's a vehicle, a conduit.
Right.
To be used. Just by virtue of creating a trust document, putting it in place, at that point, I don't think you've changed anything relative to the way the jail, as an example, is currently, what responsibilities the authority would have versus where the responsibilities are now. I think that's probably the subject of an agreement between the county and the trust, once created, you could call it an operational agreement, whereby you would lay out the trust is going to do these things, the sheriff's going to do these things, and in consideration of the trust doing these things, the county is going to. You've got to line out what those responsibilities are, and frankly, you also have to create a payment mechanism to get dollars over there. And I think that needs to be the subject of ultimately some type of, for lack of a better term, an operating agreement. And it's something that would probably need to be hammered out. It would involve, all the stakeholders heavily involved with the DA, okay, in terms of how we strike that balance. But that was one of the questions in that Tulsa case. So just who does what? What can the authority do versus the sheriff?
With an operational agreement, then, would that give the trust the authority, so to speak, for operational oversight without having to actually put the physical assets, the jail, into the trust? They could still belong to the county?
I think at least initially it makes sense probably to leave title where it is, okay? That can become an issue later. In other words, if you do a financing and there's a request by a lender or a bond insurance company, credit facility provider, as an example, they might want, we've had situations where they want a mortgage on the jail facility, or at least some kind of assignment of revenues. Typically, it's more a function of wanting a mortgage in the event. Your normal structure is you have typically a sales tax. That's not always the case, but you have some kind of sales tax levied by the county that's appropriated, subject to year-to-year appropriation by the county to the jail trust. Because it's subject to year-to-year appropriation, some lenders or credit enhancement providers want a mortgage on the facility, just so if the tax isn't appropriated, they can pull the use away.
And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that Tulsa County leases the jail to the sheriff.
I don't know the answer to that. I'd have to look at that. Again, we've done other jail transactions around the state, and sometimes they just want a year-to-year appropriation of tax, purely a moral obligation. That's a lot of times enough. I can think of at least one situation where we had bond insurance, and the bond insurance company wasn't comfortable with that. They wanted to see more than just the moral obligation to appropriate the tax. That's going to be driven. Once you decide what you're going to do, to the extent you borrow money at all, at some level, what is the lender requirement? But I would say at this point, unless there's some reason that trust can think of, or the commissioners can think of to change title, I'm not sure that benefits.
Thank you, Alan.
Sure.
What other questions with regard to potential scope, either as it's laid out in the working document or as it may be modified for ultimate recommendation to the board?
I don't know if this falls under the scope, but in the Tulsa's trust, they named the municipalities in the trust as part of boarding of prisoners. Is that something that we would do?
I don't know that that's necessary, okay? Again, the Tulsa situation, Meredith, that was Tulsa was actually, city of Tulsa, as well as Tulsa County were beneficiaries. It was not a single beneficiary trust, it was a multi-beneficiary trust. So, there was definitely more city involvement, there's more city involvement than is contemplated in this document. This draft today, this is purely a county beneficiary trust.
Okay.
That was actually one of the questions on my list.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman.
No, it's fine. I'm glad that you asked it, and we're on the same page. But, yeah, cities as beneficiaries, because, again, we know the structure that we're looking at is significantly different from Tulsa County as far as the representation of the trustees. But, again, that is something to consider. We touched a little bit on pros and cons of the actual jail being put in the trust versus, just kind of the operational agreement that gives the trust authority, so to speak. Are there any other questions along those lines about what might be the difference or the benefit of having it outside? I mean, again, Mr. Brooks outlined that potentially later on, if there is some sort of dedicated revenue source, if there is some sort of bond, if we're talking about a new building, new construction, renovation, circumstances might change, but at this point in time, again, the operational agreement will take care of the necessarily power, or the power that's necessary, I should say. Any questions along those lines? What about indemnification language? One of the things that we noticed was missing from our trust document is any sort of indemnification, and just from a legal standpoint, what are we talking about as far as liability? If the trust is formed, the trust is responsible for oversight of financial operations. What happens when somebody gets injured in the jail? Does it change?
I don't know that it does. I'm not sure I don't know if I can answer that question off the top of my head. I mean, certainly your individual trustees are not liable as long as that's working within their authority. But in terms of, I mean, at the end of the day, I mean, are we not really kind of ultimately talking about the same entity? In other words, it's a county beneficiary trust. I mean, I think ultimately, if there's a problem, it probably ends back on the tax rolls. If there's a judgment, it's my gut.
Well, I do think, though, as it relates to that, if there's any type of negotiation on any suits that could potentially arise, then whether the Board of County Commissioners are the named party or the trust is the named party, if the obligation is ultimately going to come back on the county, then I think one thing that we need to make sure of is that the trust would not be negotiating potential settlements that would impact the county, that it would actually be the Board of County Commissioners that are negotiating and approving any settlements.
Francis, we probably, in my mind, we want to bring the DA into those conversations as well in terms of
Right.
that issue ultimately.
Because I seem to recall language that the trust would negotiate settlement or something like that. It's later on in the document, but I think that's something that we would.
It's kind of a broad language that the trust effectively has the powers of a natural person. In other words, sue, be sued, the contract, the whole laundry list. But,
With relation to indemnification or liability, though, that could be included in the operational document as well, could it not? As far as laying out specifically who's responsible for what, and who would be liable for what.
That would seem to be a reasonable place to do that. Again, the idea is to keep this structure broad and then maybe the specifics in an operational agreement and ultimately an individual transaction document to the extent there are transactions. But that
I do have, if you don't mind, I have a question that goes back to the scope, and I should have asked this a minute ago, but you had mentioned leaving the scope as broad as possible, and you can narrow it by the operation agreement or by practice or whatever. However, when we're looking at whether it's Title 60 or Title 19, a jail trust, in here, we do have broad language that talks about law enforcement that is not part of a jail operation. Is that something that should be excluded from this document?
And I think it's purely preference. In other words, it certainly could be included in the broad framework of the document. Again, if you want it more narrow to make sure that that doesn't fall under the scope of the document, it should be pulled out. So it's.
Well,
I don't think there's a right or wrong answer on that.
Well, if the statutes give authorization for the Board of County Commissioners to create a trust to operate a jail, that's different than giving the Board of County Commissioners the authority to create a trust to operate the law enforcement mechanism of a county. So if we're talking about a Title 60 or Title 19 trust that talks about operation of a jail, is the rest of the Title 60 trust language broad enough that law enforcement could be swept in, or would we be talking about adding something in here to make it broad that would not be legally attainable by the trust, even if it wanted to do that? Does that make sense?
It does. It is not I mean, there's oftentimes language in the trust indenture that, again, is broad, sweeping language to take into account. I mean, so Randy, we're working with trust documents today without modification that were created in the 70s, all right? That are not, I mean, they were broad for the 70s, but I mean, law has changed a lot since then, and so you're always going to be limited by what you can, quote, legally do. But again, oftentimes you make your trust document essentially broad to say whatever we can legally do, all right?
So it covers you if the statute's changing, you can legally do something later on down the road. You don't have to go and modify the document.
Just as it's not really on point, but as an example, we'll find old documents that try to put in competitive bidding provisions of exact dollar amounts. I mean, it doesn't make sense. The limit for it's changing. So, I mean, you might say, I mean, there's something here that says we'll comply with the Open Records Act and Open Meeting Act. I don't know that needs to be in there because you have to comply with Open Records Act and Open Meeting Act regardless of whether the trust document says that or not, okay? So, again, on the one hand, you don't necessarily need to recite compliance with statutes, and that was probably our draft, okay? In other words, that's something that worked its way in. Some lawyer somewhere, it could have been us, could have been somebody else, said, hey, let's put it here, we're going to comply with the Open Meeting Act. Well, again, you don't have a choice, all right? So that kind of stuff a lot of times doesn't need to be there, and then the broad things, you have to work under the theory, you can only do what you can legally do, regardless of how far-reaching the trust is. But having said that, if the trust is far-reaching and the law changes, arguably you have the flexibility to move forward. I don't know if that's responsive
Yes,
to the question.
It is. I appreciate that.
That's the idea. Okay? I mean, again, a lot of the trusts we create anymore, this has a specific scope. I mean, this is, let's call it jail, children's law enforcement, whatever you want to call it. This has scope. But a lot of the trust documents we create, we throw everything in that can possibly be thrown in that might be done by a public trust, whether it's healthcare, economic development, utilities, tourism. I mean, you just throw it all in there, and it's subject, I mean, the trustees and ultimately the beneficiary of the trust makes decisions as to which pieces they want to use. It doesn't make sense to do that here, but what you've done is you've kind of narrowed the scope to, again, pick the term we're going to use, jail-related purposes, and in theory, everything related to jail-related transactions kind of got thrown in.
Okay.
Any other questions along this line?
No, thanks for indulging.
Of course. I passed out a document I meant to distribute it early on. This is something that we received from Terry Simonson at Tulsa County. I'm sorry if I didn't have enough copies for everyone. For certain things that we might consider for inclusion in the trust, The first one being, operations, what does that mean? And again, I think that's part of the question that you had, Mr. Satterwhite, regarding making sure that that's clear who is responsible for what, so there's not mission creep into, what the sheriff's duties are and what the trust responsibilities are. And I know I'm kind of catching you on the fly with this, Mr. Brooks, but number 2...
We should call me Alan.
I'm sorry. Sometimes when I sit in this seat, my old legislative voice take over, and I have a hard time.
You make me feel very old.
These guys are often castigating me for that. So, but number 2, and again, this is something that, the county is, we don't want any additional liability if we can help it for anyone. And so number 2 talks about having full-time employees of the trust, and I was just wondering if you had any insight or opinions about, again, the trust being a shell, so to speak, with relation to full-time employees.
I try not to answer questions that I don't have any idea what the answer is, and that's probably where I am on that one. So again, that's one I think we need to look at, and again, involve ultimately the DA, and that, the vast majorities of public trusts around the state, in fact, have employees, all right? I would think, again, I can't speak to jail trusts per se, but, a very high percentage of your public trusts actually have employees, and the trust is going to have to, get its own tax ID number. Ultimately, it's going to have, it's going to have an audit that might well be part and parcel of the county audit, but anyway, that's one I think we need to look into a little bit.
Well, and again, it was a little bit confusing to me because, again, he talks about, Mr. Simonson talks about in number 7, the trust being allowed to hire a manager. And again, I don't know if this is something that they hire on a contract basis versus the full-time employee. Of course, retaining separate general counsel is something that I think is very wise. That just makes sense from the trust perspective. Anyways, these were distributed a couple of meetings ago, and I don't know if you guys have had a chance to go back and look at these or think about some of the things that Tulsa County had recommended, but if you have any questions along those lines, I think it'd be appropriate to ask them.
Plan for 30 days. Again, item 1, that seems like something that would fall under the operational agreement ultimately. The operational agreement could deal with number 2 as well. 3. Again, I don't know that personally. I don't know that you need a local cooperative jail financing agreement. Again, maybe that's just another word for an operating agreement. But
well, I think that speaks more to their specific arrangement with relation to a predicated revenue source that doesn't fully fund the jail, and then Tulsa County, as they explained to us, they have to go, or the trust has to go to other resources, including the county budget board, and say, we're short, you need to go ahead and appropriate us an additional amount so that we can run the jail.
On number 5, staggered terms, that's a great concept, okay? Oftentimes it works out, though, that as people, a lot of people don't serve out the term. At least that's been our experience. You can start off with staggered terms. And again, the way the document's written now, you appoint a replacement to fill the remaining portion of the terms. That arguably kind of keeps you in that process. where they're staggered, but it's pretty easy to do. End of the day, I'm not sure ultimately how much you tend to, I would expect that you have appointees that get appointed, and the county commissioners and the sheriff, those are ex officio, they're changing, as they change, but those appointed positions, it wouldn't be surprising that somebody gets appointed, they might stay on there for a significant period of time. I mean, there's frankly some benefit to that, but anyway, that's something that's pretty easy to put in place, but in practice tends to fall away over time.
Well, there's a natural staggering that takes place to a certain extent because of our election cycle and
Correct.
The commissioners are elected and the sheriff's elected and things like that. But I know that is something that we had talked about, is trying to maintain some sort of continuity so you don't have, seven new members come in at the same time.
Again, that's a really easy fix on the front end. I mean, that's just a tweak of the language. I guess 6 is kind of focused on the dual office holding question in terms of
I thought the sole purpose was to avoid political grandstanding.
I mean, again, number 8 is back to my point where it talks about consider having in there addressing executive sessions again. That's statutory stuff that you're subject to regardless of whether it's in the document or not. So that I'm not sure what point he's made. What point's being made on number 9?
I think 9 and 10 are rather specific to some of the issues they've encountered specifically in Tulsa County.
I do think, when we were discussing staggered terms, I think especially, setting it up in the beginning to where it may work itself out down the road, but in the beginning, it won't necessarily. So I think setting it up from the beginning, have some staggered terms, would potentially prove to be very good, and on the downside, unnecessary. Whereas if you don't have it, it can prove to either be unnecessary or on the bad side really bad because you have a brain drain all of a sudden. I do think that was something that we need to look at, and I think I mentioned this before, currently for BOCC, the chief deputy that's been designated by the commissioner sits in their stead if they're unavailable for BOCC. However, PBA, the Public Buildings Authority, the way that trust is set up, the chief deputy cannot sit for the commissioner if the commissioner is unavailable or detained for some reason. I do think that potentially adding language that the commissioner's chief deputy or designee could sit for them.
Legally speaking, is that permissible?
Well, we've seen it in other places.
Okay, well,
short answer, I think it is. I mean, I don't know about the concept of, for just their designee generally. I think, personally, I would think it would need to be a specific person, okay? And somebody who could sign, taking an oath of office, as opposed to if the chief deputy is not available, then send somebody. Okay. So I think maybe.
And the reason why I use that, for instance, I'll use Commissioner Vaughn because he's in here right now. Rick Buchanan is his chief deputy. If Rick is out of town, well, then Randy, the first deputy, Commissioner Vaughn would probably, file a letter that makes him the chief deputy while Rick is out, and then we'll reassume later. If that was the case and Commissioner Vaughn was unavailable and Rick was out of town and Randy was the acting chief deputy, then Randy would be able to sit. But you could do that with just chief deputy language because you would be at that point the chief deputy. So
I think that's worthwhile.
It's clear. I think we have seen that. I mean, not seen it in a significant number of situations, but particularly Oklahoma City, Oklahoma County, I mean, where you've got a lot of meetings, and, I mean, I think it makes some sense.
Alan, what other considerations do we need to make when setting up a trust, and also looking towards the operational agreement that we would have to recommend to the commissioners?
Well, it seemingly makes sense to create the trust or have that in place, so you have an actual party that you're dealing with. But that again, we can certainly talk through and make some of the changes that have been discussed today. I think that the second step, and frankly, the more meaningful step, would be the operational arrangement. I think that needs to be have the heavy involvement from the DA's office. By way of our expertise, creating trust, not an issue, election laws, debt issuance, that's all stuff that we do every day. In terms of knowing the ins and outs of what the county and the sheriff can do relative to each other, that the DA's office is probably far more versed in that than we are. So I would argue that maybe the operational agreement, the DA, if someone in the DA's office probably takes the lead on that. We're certainly happy to be involved in it. I think they're going to have a lot more practical experience as it relates to that. Again, we certainly are happy to participate and help, but I think that would be probably the better person to do that, unless you guys have other thoughts. But it's...
Ms. Etherington, do you have any opinions on that?
I do. I think there's a potential for conflict that would prevent the DA's office from being involved.
How so?
Well, unless the sheriff's office is in agreement to allow us to participate, we're put into a position where we can't represent the interests of both of our clients. They have competing interests.
Fair enough. So everybody has to get outside counsel?
Or everyone has to waive any potential conflict.
Well, on that nugget of good news.
I think this might be the first time where there are more attorneys in the room than there are non-attorneys. That doesn't happen very often.
7.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm back in normal.
Well, no, now you know how we feel most of the time. Hey, go ahead, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, just real quick, one of the other, I don't want to forget this, but under the powers and duties of trustees, under item 31, the second to last sentence, it says they, being the trustees, may compromise and settle any suit or action and discharge the same amount of assets of the trust estate together with court costs and attorney's fees. That's kind of what I was referencing earlier about, I think that should go to the board and not to the trustees. Just a thought.
Talk about how we finance the trust. And again, not wanting to too far into the weeds, but certainly at this point we don't have any sort of dedicated funding source. So the way that I understand it is the budget board makes an appropriation to the trust and says this is what you have to do, what you're charged to do under the operational arrangement, and they're funded just like any other county office or department. Is that fair?
The authority itself, they have no taxing power. Okay, they have no source of revenue per se. So, yeah, I would say that any, and by virtue of the fact that it's a county trust, in other words, I mean, again, not knowing the ins and outs of the Tulsa arrangement, I don't know if the city of Tulsa and the Tulsa County provide funding. But having said that, I mean, there's really not another source of funding, so it's gonna, again, it just has to be budgeted by the county.
And then once it is,
You will disagree with me, won't you, if I say something stupid? Please.
That was not a waiver of conflict.
For the record, we've worked for various entities in the county too, so maybe we all have a conflict, but anyway, it's.
But could the trust make a recommendation to the budget board for funding?
I think they would have to, right?
Well, that's kind of the way I see it.
Because they would have to say, this is what
Right.
it takes. I mean, like it's done now, this is what is needed to fund jail operations. Fixed costs. Not fixed costs, all of those different things that we have to consider every year.
If the trust wanted to seek outside donations, would that need to be spelled out in the trust indenture to allow them?
Did you say donations? I mean, like corporate sponsorships or?
Well, yeah,
I just didn't know anybody donated.
I didn't either. The county clerk last week was in, or not last week, but at our last meeting, and mentioned that he thought there were some nonprofit companies out there that would be potentially willing to pony up some cash to help. I'm just wondering if that were the case.
I mean, I'll go back, I can reread I bet Powers' language is broad enough right now. I mean, in terms of, if somebody wants to give you money, and I'm not trying to be a smart aleck, but I mean, if somebody gives you money, it doesn't take a lot of power in theory to accept it versus, I know you're.
Right, I'm going out to
raise
even beyond that, to raise and to solicit.
But I think that the Tulsa County Sheriff's Office has a foundation, which
is a totally separate entity.
which is a totally separate deal, but, I would be in support of some sort of foundation for the benefit of the Sheriff's Office. Because there are certain, obviously, programs, and that you can apply for grants, which I know the Sheriff's Office does. But certainly something that could benefit. And I don't know, but if we do need something within the trust language itself. I mean, the clerk's question was, isn't that the purpose of the trust? And it's not necessarily the primary purpose of a public trust. I'm not sure if it's the purpose at all. A public trust is not like our private estate trust, and I think that's kind of where he was coming from on that. Anyways, that is something to explore. Again, I don't know to what extent people want to give charitable contributions to the operations of the jail, but certainly there are investments to be made in rehabilitation and purchasing Bibles for inmates. I mean, there's all sorts of things like that is done and can be done. That's a good question. Something.
Thank you.
Number one, create the trust first, which is really kind of the organic document, if you will, that just sets up the entities. Number two, really work on the operational arrangements, and that would be, and you stated not only that, but previously, I think you said something about individual transaction documents, about the way that you kind of clarify or narrow the broad powers with the operational agreement and then individual transaction documents. What do you mean by that?
Individual transaction documents could could dictate that we might have to go in and, for example, look at where title to the facility is held. In other words, that there's a lender or, again, rating agency, credit provider indicate they need at least the leasehold interest, a long-term lease of the facility to the trust, and a mortgage on that leasehold interest. Again, those are the kind of things that can come up once you're involved in a transaction. And those are things that arguably we could deal with and respond to at that point in time. Because again, at this point, I mean, at least as I understand it, we're not really sure where this is headed in terms of new jail, rework old jail, borrow money, what's the source of repayment, if you borrow money at all. So again, those are issues that can come up in the course of looking at a financing. I mean, we've had situations that we might need to change operational agreements, or again, relationships with, where titles held, those kind of things, to accommodate a financing, get the best possible rate.
The operational agreement is something that exists between the trust and the county, correct?
That's what I would assume. And again, it's more than just what seemingly that would be the place where you would lay out responsibilities. And again, I mean, this entity, once it's created, it has no money, so you're going to have to be subject again to the budget appropriation from the county, and that might well be set forth in the operational agreement, at least how that process is going to work. In other words, the authority puts together a budget, submits for the operation of the jail, submits the budget to the county. The county those are the kind of things that could be laid out in that process, in that agreement.
Has a very limited amount, I'm showing you 2 minutes, in order to walk across the street. Are there any additional questions from committee members?
I have a question for the chair. You had...
Not for me,
Well,
for Mr. Brooks, he has 2 minutes.
no, I don't, Mr. Brooks, I appreciate it. It was about the operational agreement, and if...
Well, let's hold off on that for 1 second. Are there any questions from sheriff's representatives, Commissioner Rubrick? I mean, again, we don't have a whole...
Mr. Burton, clarification on the point you made on the handout you provided. I believe what Mr. Simonson's getting at relative to points 2, 7, and 10. 7 is speaking to employees of the trust itself. I believe he was more speaking on 2 and 10, having the employees of the sheriff's office be under the employee of the trust. I think that's what he was talking about there, and I think that there was some confusion with the committee and yourself as you were discussing it, so I'm going to point that out to you in case that is something you need to engage to look at.
Thank you. Mr. Honeycutt. Well, Alan, we certainly appreciate your time today. Anything else?
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I mean, do you have a sense of timing on this, where you're wanting to, when do you want to have this process completed? When do you plan to, do you plan to have another meeting?
2 weeks ago.
Okay, 2 weeks. All right.
No.
So, no, I get it. I mean, you're right in line with all of our other clients.
Well, one of the things that we're going to talk about under new business today is, when we're going to be able to meet again next week, because we've been, it's just been difficult.
It's not on the agenda.
Oh, so we can't talk about when we're going to meet again?
It's a special
No,
meeting.
you can just
Oh.
do a call to the chair.
Okay, well, we're not going to talk about that, because I can't. Anyways, we're going to meet next week.
FYI, I'm out of state Monday and Tuesday.
Okay. But, and sooner rather than later is the answer to your question as far as getting something to the Board of County Commissioners. This has been helpful, I think, and it's good to know that our organic document is salvageable to a certain extent.
I don't think it's far off at all, at least in my opinion.
And then we can work out those and, just get it drafted up how it needs to be in approval form, so to speak.
And obviously, before you approve it, you need to know who your appointees are. And again, I need to going to flip back and look at, do we have the appointed trustees, were they 3-year terms? Did it say? I don't remember.
Well, I think it'll depend on if we go staggered
If we go
terms or
staggered,
straight terms.
again, you just.
I think it was 3 in here, but if you
So
did
maybe
staggered, it'd probably be 1, 2,
1,
and
2,
3.
3, and you just, and maybe line them up. Might make sense to line them up with the commission that's appointing them, where they, I don't know if this is normally the case. As an example, one commissioner goes away, new commissioner comes on, is that new commissioner, would it be normal that commissioner would designate, in this situation, a new trustee representative typically?
It depends on the different authorities and boards and things that we have. Sometimes they are able to, it seems like, and then sometimes they have to let the appointee finish out the term. Is that correct? It seems like it's different for every board and commission.
That's one thing that I have in mind, though, that I've been contemplating on how that would work.
Or to the extent the appointee lines up with the commissioner's term that's appointing them, that might, in other words, if we line those up based on remaining term of existing commissioners, then we'll that would maybe simplify that, at least on the front end, but I don't know.
Well, except 2 commissioners have the same election cycle.
Commissioners are elected for 4 years.
Right.
And then, so maybe we change it to, maybe even make it again, a 4-year term versus a 3-year. Something to think about. We can work through that.
Yeah, currently it is the 3-year. Okay. Please give our best to our friends at Oklahoma City.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for all your.
Is there any action to be taken on item number 3?
You mean item 4?
I'm sorry, item number 4, thank you.
I make a motion to receive the report.
Second.
There's been a motion and a second, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries 3-0. Item number 5. So I think we're at this point where, again, we start considering individual changes to the draft document. I'm happy to discuss any of those at this time. Personally, I think I need to take under consideration some of the things that Mr. Brooks said, go through it again with some of these things that we talked about. Steve, your point about cities as beneficiaries, go to your points in the very beginning about these staggered terms, and think about how we might propose that and then come together and hammer out the language just like a committee does. If you're ready to do that now, then I'm happy to entertain any motions.
I do have one question, though, before we go further. On the operation agreement, I know you got a lot of stuff from Tulsa County. Have you seen an operation agreement that they are utilizing?
Not that I recall, but certainly that is something that I know if they did have it, they would be happy to provide to us. So I will follow up with Mr. Simonson and ask for any sort of operational agreement. Obviously, he references the finance agreement that they have, which I just don't think is going to be very relevant to us. So I will put that on my list of things to do, and we'll distribute that. Anything else with relation to item 5? Is there any action to be taken on item 5? Okay, no action to be taken on item 5. Item number 6, citizen participation. Are there any citizens that would like to participate? Seeing none. Item number 7, board comments. District 1.
No, thank you.
District 2.
No, thank you.
According to our previous conversation, the chair will be calling a meeting for next week. Again, we'll attempt to consult to make sure that we can all make it. And I expect that what we'll be discussing is kind of what we talked about under item 5, and that is getting this into a form that we can recommend it to the commissioners. Item number 8 is to adjourn. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. We are adjourned. Always a pleasure doing business.